Growing up in a small town is hard on adolescent teens. There really is little to do with friends on long, hot summer days. Our town had a small park in the center, with a gazebo where we would often meet and hang out, just talking and joking with each other, and a cemetery on the outskirts where we would go to walk. It was cooler in the graveyard, with the tall oak trees giving shade and a small brook that ran through the center with a pond. It may seem strange to city people that we spent a lot of time there, but we didn't have many other choices. Our town was far from the state parks and hiking trails, and there were no arcades, amusement centers, or roller rinks. So, the graveyard was our place. We were always considerate of burials and very respectful of the graves. We never did anything that would have been considered disrespectful or in any way dishonored the memories of the dead. We mostly walked and ran around the markers playing tag. On summer nights, we would stay after dark, sit in a circle and tell ghost stories, urban legends, and stories of the Indian tribes that lived in this area. It gave us all an adrenaline high, and we would get so scared we would have to run from the graveyard home. One particular night I will never forget. It was the most frightening night of my life, and the most terrifying event in my life. We had been hanging out at the cemetery. It was a hot day, so not doing much more than talking. It was getting late, the sun had set, and everything in the cemetery was dead still, not a whisper of wind. One of our friends started to tell a new scary story with great animation that he had heard on YouTube. We all gathered around in a half circle and listened without interruption. Then a child's voice called out from the dark behind us. A little girl we could not see said, "That's a scary story." A hush came over our group, and we looked at each other with eyes wide, and no one dared to breathe. The child's voice came again out of the darkness.
"Have you seen my family?"
We stared into the darkness, and the headstones were just barely visible in the moonlight, but we could not see a child. One of our group stood up, faced the darkness, and asked calmly, "Have you lost your family?" He continued trying to coax the child out of hiding, saying everything would be okay. "We will help you find your family." That is when an energy descended down upon us that was indescribable. We all felt it simultaneously. It made the hair on our arms stand on edge. Several of us who had flashlights with us began to search for the lost child, shining our lights around the graveyard, but no child was spotted. Every step we took, more and more foreboding and fear heightened. None of us could explain the child's voice in the dark that came from nowhere that we could agree on. We all pointed in different directions from where we heard it come from. Two of us started walking down a path that led past a mausoleum, our flashlights flickering back and forth across the path. In a flash, we saw a little girl's head peek out from between two headstones. We called out to her calmly, saying nothing to fear, "We're here to help." But no one was there when we approached the two headstones and looked behind them. We no longer gather at the cemetery. We know what we saw. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, a modern city steeped in much Cherokee Indian lore. My great-great-grandparents settled here as tobacco farmers. Our family has been on this land for over 150 years. As a child in a rural area outside Asheville, my schedule was to wake up, eat breakfast, and go outside and play. At noon, come home and eat. Then go outside and play. At dusk, come in, wash, eat, pray, and sleep. My brother and I played in the barn on rainy days, and in the fields or threw rocks in the stream on nice days. We had Daisy BB guns. We shot everything that moved or didn't. We ate apples from the tree and built castles in the clay pit. We were given complete freedom to roam the farm, except for one part of the pasture, where there was an outcropping that was circled by ancient trees. It was off limits. The cows seemed to know this too, and they never wandered into the circle. Our grandmother, who lived with us, has lived on this farm since she married our grandpa at age 17. She's in her 80s now. She told us that inside the circle was an ancient Indian graveyard, and we were never to enter it. It was strictly off limits. My brother and I would go close and spy on the place. We could see tall staffs with feathers and dream catchers. There were lots of animal skulls and bones scattered around. Everywhere, feathers hung on the branches of the trees, and many ancient artifacts were scattered on the ground. It was still a place of spirits, and the Cherokees still came to care for their ancestors buried here. As children, we could hear drums beating and see the ghosts of men dressed in feathers chanting. Grandmother constantly told us to stay away and not disturb the dead, or bad things would happen. Of course, since I was a child, the admonishment went in one ear and out the other. For the very same week, I had been wading in the stream catching tadpoles. When it neared lunchtime, I had to pass near the Indian burial circle on the path home. I wasn't going to go into the burial ground, just peek as I passed. Looking through the brush under the tree circle, I could see all the poles with feathers, dream catchers, bowls, and hunting tools. I saw a string hanging on a low branch with a small circular stone, not too far inside the circle. I darted in, grabbed it, and darted back out, reasoning I wasn't in the ring because I was so quick. I ran back to the house for lunch with my prize in my pocket. I ate lunch and took my plate to the sink as we were taught. My grandmother said,
"I told you to stay away from the cemetery."
I lied and said I wasn't in the cemetery. She looked at me and said,
"I know you were in that cemetery."
How she knew was a mystery. The cemetery is in the field that isn't in view of the house in any way. As I headed out the kitchen door, she said,
"Boy, if you took anything from there, take it back."
My brother and I played for the rest of the day, hunting squirrels with our BB guns. At dusk, we went in, had dinner, and prepared for bed. I was still trying to figure out how Grandma knew I had taken the amulet that was still in my pocket. After prayers, I was exhausted and could barely keep my eyes open. I thought I saw my grandma entering the room, but it wasn't her. It was so frightening. It was the shape of a man, but with the face of an animal. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. I tried to call out to my brother in the next bed, but the shape covered my mouth with a clawed hand. I had that sickening feeling I was going to die. Then I didn't remember anything until morning when I awoke. I was still trembling from the chilling nightmare when I got down to the kitchen table for breakfast. Grandma was there making pancakes and asked us,
"Boys, how you slept?"
My brother blurted out he had a horrible nightmare, that someone had broken into our house, but it wasn't a person, and he couldn't explain exactly what it was. Grandma looked at me and said I told you to stay away from that burial ground. Whatever you stole from that ground, you must return it without delay. Otherwise, your nightmares will continue to haunt your nights until you wake up in the graveyard. My older brother died in a car accident 5 years ago. We were close, even though I was 4 years younger. I had a hard time accepting he was gone. I would go and talk with him at the cemetery when I was feeling down. He was always there for me. It helped me a lot. For this reason, I never thought anything could keep me away, but something has. I'd stop by the graveyard at odd times, never on a schedule or anything. It was on one of these unplanned visits that this terrifying event happened. I had been at work all day and was exhausted. I was frustrated with my coworkers and needed to vent, so I swung by the cemetery to see my brother and let off a little steam. It was already dark, as it was mid-December and after 6 o'clock. A few lights are on in the cemetery, and even though there's a gate, it is never locked. I headed toward my brother's grave, which was pretty far back. As I walked, I noticed there were glass mason jars resting on top of many of the headstones. I thought that was strange. I wonder what they're for. I didn't go look as it was super cold, and I wanted to get to my brother. But to my surprise, a large mason jar was resting on the top of my brother's marker. I was curious and bent down with my cell phone flashlight to examine it, but it was very cloudy and dark, and I couldn't see a thing. As I went to pick it up, it slipped in my hand and fell on the headstone lintel and shattered. And there in the broken glass was a man's hand, severed at the wrist. I was in shock and fell backward against another headstone. I looked up and saw a mason jar on top of it as well, and in the lamplight, I could clearly see, to my horror, that in the jar was a human heart. I tried to remain calm, but I was having difficulty breathing, and my heart was pounding. I couldn't catch my breath in panic. I tried to focus and find the cell phone I had dropped to call the police. As I looked around for it on my hands and knees, I saw a figure moving towards me from the other side of the graveyard. Whoever had placed those mason jars was still in the cemetery. I picked myself up and scrambled for my car at the front of the cemetery. I had to cross the entire graveyard, which was pretty far in the dark. As I ran, I could hear someone else running after me, but I didn't turn to look. I focused on my car. When I got to the car, I locked the door to tear out of there as fast as possible. Down the road, a short way, I dialed the police and told them that some man was placing body parts in jars on gravestones at the cemetery and that he was still there. The dispatcher sent several patrol cars, and they found the mason jars but not the man. The newspaper reported that at least 17 jars were recovered with human organs the next day. Since there were 4 hearts, it was determined at least 4 different people were in the jars. I most likely encountered a serial killer.